When I was rather young, maybe 12 years old, I'm now 74, so that's 62 years ago. So I was about 12. I was intrigued by the notion of God. And I read all in the literature and in the science, all the arguments for and against the existence of God. So at an early age, I had that spiritual bent. But I knew nothing about Buddhism at that time. And I was very interested also in aeronautical engineering and in mathematics. So that was my studies. Both in high school, I went to a special school for aeronautical engineering. And then in college, I majored in aeronautical engineering for my undergraduate work. And in my junior year in college, so in 1958, I read a book called The Religions of Man by a man named Houston Smith. And there was one page on Zen. And that was my first introduction to Zen. And it felt like home for me. So that began my journey into Zen. And I then got all of the books in English and read all of the books in English. And at that time, in 58, what was written did not describe meditation practice. They described the philosophy of Zen and used the word meditation, but didn't describe how to meditate or what that really is. But in 1960, I started to meditate by myself without any guidance. And in fact, I started to do long retreats by myself. And then in 1963, I went to a Japanese temple in Los Angeles. It was for the Japanese community, but they had a meditation group. The Japanese weren't doing the meditation. The temple was to help the Japanese population acclimate to the United States. But there was a meditation group, mostly Westerners, not very big. And the abbot of that temple led the meditation, and he had a young monk helping him. And the abbot didn't speak English. The young monk did. And that young monk, his name was Mayuzumi, and he becomes my teacher. Not immediately. I stopped going to that temple after a year because of there really was no English going on, and I felt I could do it myself. But then, maybe a year later, I had an experience in which I felt I lost myself, and I thought I was going crazy, that I was going insane, and it frightened me, and I stopped meditating. I stopped meditating for a year. And then I heard that there was a workshop being given by a man that I had read about. His name was Yasutani Roshi, was giving the workshop. And so I went to the workshop, and the young monk that I had met was translating. So this Mayuzumi was translating for Yasutani. And after the workshop, I went up to Mayuzumi and said, is it possible to do meditation with you, Zazen? They call it Zazen. And he said, yes, I have a small place. And that's when I started full-time with this Mayuzumi to study. All this time, I had a parallel life as an engineer. I worked in the aerospace industry. In 1970, I got a PhD in mathematics, but it was all involved in the aerospace industry. But all along, I was also heavily involved in the Zen temple. And in fact, I would take off a week every month to do retreat, and I would take off a few hours every day so that I could sit in the morning and the evening. And at work, they let me do that. And maybe because my work was fine, and I became a manager, I rose up in the ranks. But then eventually I left full time because I wanted to help build a monastery, and then I became in '76, I became a full-time teacher there. But from 1969 on, my teacher was using me as to give talks and to give interviews. So I was somewhat a teacher from 1969 on. And each year I would go for a month to Japan with my Zumiyoshi, and he would introduce me to everybody. And one of the people that he introduced me to very early on was Yamada Roshi, who had studied under this man Yasutani Roshi, and Yasutani Roshi was one of 3 teachers of Maezumi Roshi. And in fact, Yasutani Roshi used to come to the United States, and my first koan work, my first studies of koan Zen was with Yasutani Roshi. But he stopped coming to the United States in 1969. So on the trips, I met Yamada Roshi, and a few times I met Father LaSalle, who was studying with Yasutani Roshi. He had started with Yasutani Roshi's teacher, Harada Roshi. So that was a gang that I was sort of familiar with. We'd visit each year.